Chapter 6, Ecosystems and Evolution. First part of this chapter goes through and discusses some of the major biomes found around the world. So the take-home message from this section is to be able to talk a little bit about each of the biomes, things like the climate for each of those biomes, and the types of plants or animals that live in those areas, and certainly things like the challenges that these biomes face. So again, this is probably the one chapter where it's going to be important for you to read through the information. And again, I'll go through and highlight things in this section. So the first section to talk about here is an introduction to the chapter that focuses on the Florida Everglades. The Everglades are a sawgrass-dominated wetland which occurs in southern Florida. Sawgrass is a type of grass species. Its biggest challenge is kind of tied back to humans again. Basically, it's now half of its original size due to humans directly, but things like water quality being affected by the development of cities like Miami and so forth. The introduction of a lot of exotic predatory species and a lot of exotic animals and plants that just outcompete the native species. This part of our country is one of those climates that's very much like a tropical climate. So a lot of the aggressive species from other warm, humid climates around the world do really, really well in this area. A lot of species of snakes, pets that people just get tired of, or they get too big for their aquarium or their home. So a lot of wildlife problems. And then, of course, fragmentation because of all the cities that develop in this area. Certainly the government and the state is working to restore these areas by trying to get native species back where they used to be, like the alligator, for example, and a lot of other bird species that had been moved from this area or eliminated completely. You can see the bar graph on the right that talks about the number of nesting attempts made by some of these wading birds. Wading birds are those kind of long-legged birds that you typically see around the water. If you go to the ocean, you'll see a variety of small, medium, and larger birds that walk in the shallow water looking for their food. So that's what we're talking about here as well. And again, you can see from the 30s to the 80s a tremendous decline in nesting attempts, which means obviously that if they aren't successful at nesting, they're not going to be able to sustain their population. So there are a lot of endangered ecosystems in the United States, but certainly the Florida Everglades is receiving more than its fair share of problems that we're trying to deal with. Alright, so for this next large section of the book, we'll be going through talking about each of the major biomes on the Earth. And the biome that we're looking at are large, relatively distinct terrestrial regions. There are aquatic biomes as well, but we'll be focusing on the terrestrial biomes. Basically, these are areas that are similar with respect to their climate, which again is the long-term weather patterns as opposed to the weather, which is daily changes. But in addition to that, they are similar with respect to the types of soils, plants, and animals, regardless of where the biomes are located in the world. And again, looking at this large map of the Earth, you can see desert biomes indicated by a sort of peachy color exist in much of the central part of Australia, northern Africa, and Middle Eastern areas, in parts of the Asian continent, of course, in parts of North America, and then in parts of South America. And you kind of notice the trend if you follow the longitude lines back and forth, that the deserts tend to occur at the southern latitudes along that, I believe it's 30 degrees south, and in the northern latitudes at about 30 degrees north. So that place on the planet, north and south of the equator, contains similar climates, and therefore the types of plants and animals that have adapted to that climate can be similar no matter where in the world they're located. I already kind of touched on this in the last slide, but the major factors that determine one biome from another are temperature and precipitation. Now again, there are other factors that your book talks about, things like slope or elevation or a variety of things like that. But if you were to pick just the two most important factors, it would be the temperature and precipitation. And so those two factors, as well as latitude, are plotted on the triangular image on the right of this slide. And again, you can tell based on whether an area is wet or dry, whether it's hot or cold, and whether it's very high latitude like the Arctic or lower latitude like the tropical areas. That based on those three factors, we can place every biome on the planet with respect to those three factors. So again, latitude is another very important aspect. As we saw from the map of the Earth on the previous slide, the farther north or the farther south you get towards the poles, the colder it gets, and therefore you get the biomes like the tundra biome, where you have cold and relatively mild amounts of precipitation. And so the combination of that high latitude, cold temperatures, and kind of median precipitation create a climate that basically is dominated by things like lichens, caribou, eventually farther north like muskox and polar bears, and etc. So we'll talk more about those in detail. And certainly elevation also affects a biome locally. If you're in the valley here in California, whether you're up near Redding or south near Bakersfield, you have one type of biome down here in the valley. And as you move up the mountain, you move through a variety of biomes, like the sort of temperate communities, first the chaparral, up into the boreal forest. And then when you get at the very tops of the mountains where all the trees are gone, you're in a very tundra-like ecosystem. So it's not only latitude, but it's also elevation that can determine a biome. So looking at that big broad map of the Earth, you get a sense of where these biomes are located. But also within California, we have many of the biomes that are indicated on this in this chapter of the book, just as you go from low deserts that we have on the eastern Sierra on up to the higher elevations of our mountains. So I'll go through this fairly quick. Again, I believe you can read most of this yourself, and then on a quiz you can always reference this section of the chapter to check an answer of a question. But basically the Arctic tundra, very far north or very high in altitude, treeless, and dominated by boggy areas where snowmelt happens in the brief summer times, water collects, dominated by, as I mentioned, lichen and moss as the typical plants. You can also have low-growing shrubs like we see in this photograph on the bottom right of the slide. So we have alpine tundra as well as the true tundra as you go far north on the planet. Relatively low productivity because the seasons are very short, as you can see the climate graph on the upper right, comparing the amount of precipitation across a year and comparing that also with the temperature on the right side of the graph. So when you have a big portion of the year where the temperatures are below freezing, that means you got a very short growing season. And if you have a short growing season and you don't have a lot of plant growth, that implies that you cannot have a lot of animals as well. So that means they are, again, very low, relatively low productivity, but that also then means they have low resilience to change. These ecosystems, in other words, can be damaged very easily. Climate change, for example, changing the permafrost, which basically below the surface of the Earth to maybe 6, 8, 10 feet, depending on where you are, is permanently frozen. And so climate change causing the permafrost to thaw can dramatically impact that ecosystem. I've even seen examples of back when we were first settling the western U.S. and when the first wagon trains were going north towards Alaska, that there are places in the tundra where the wagon trail tracks are still there. And it's not like there were thousands and thousands of wagons going up there, maybe just dozens or hundreds. And 200 years later, the trails, those wagon paths, are still visible because that ecosystem just doesn't recover quickly when it's affected. The next lower in latitude and in elevation is the boreal forest, or taiga, as it's referred to in Europe. This is a forest dominated by conifer trees like pines, spruces, and firs. Just below the tundra as you, again, move south or north from the poles. Again, very cold winters, as you can see by the graph, and relatively small amounts of precipitation per year, 20 inches or so on average. Very acidic soils. Pines, when they drop their needles, slowly decompose and are what kind of keep the soil acidic. They just have a lower pH level in them. So relatively poor soil. They can grow trees. In some cases, the trees may never get very large, but they can grow trees, as opposed to the tundra, which is too cold and too dry to even grow trees. The ponds, or potholes as we call them, that are spread around these areas are typically remnants of when a glacier came through. The glacier advances when it gets colder and retreats when it gets warmer. And the weight of the glacier can literally scour away the soil down to the bedrock. So when the glacier retreats and melts, then it has these rock depressions that it can fill in with water. And then given time, they can evolve a variety of life that occurs there. Again, list of typical species there, but also it is an important source of industrial wood and fiber. And in places like the Asian continent, Russia and so forth, a lot of tree harvesting there. And again, because this is still a pretty cold, severe climate, the damage that can be done through over-harvesting trees can be hard to repair. So it is an important worldwide source of wood, not giant trees like we can grow in the Pacific Northwest, but still an important source of wood, but also very much susceptible to being damaged. Then we can move to areas where we have still a community dominated by conifer trees, different species than we'd find in the boreal forest. But these are areas that typically occur along the ocean, and in the United States, places like Washington, the Olympic Peninsula, but then also places like areas of Southeast Australia, areas in South America, South Africa. So these areas, because they're near the ocean, have mild winters and cool summers, never gets really cold, never gets really hot. And again, you can tell that by looking at the precipitation temperature graph. Again, dominated by conifers, but different species, hemlocks, firs, cedars, spruces, etc. And then a variety of animals, again, just a few that are listed here. Although the tundra is an important source of wood, the temperate rainforests are even a more important source of wood. And this is typically the area where we find what we typically refer to as old-growth forests. Very large trees that have been harvested heavily over the past 100 years, including using practices like clear cutting that we'll talk more about in Chapter 13. So again, we have areas in California, all up the Pacific Northwest from California on up into Alaska, that are this temperate rainforest. Again, notice this is temperate rainforest, not tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforests get much warmer and have much more precipitation. Well, precipitation maybe not as much, but definitely warmer. The temperate rainforests are relatively mild, never very hot, never very cold. Then we have a biome called the temperate deciduous forest. So the last two biomes we spoke about were conifer dominated, pine trees. This type of biome is dominated by deciduous trees. Deciduous trees are those that basically lose their leaves every year. So oaks, maples, all sorts of other trees that are typically we call hardwood trees that lose all their leaves in the fall, turn pretty colors like the image we see on the bottom of the screen. So these are types of forests that can exist where we get about 30 to 50 inches of rain each year. So we have some temperate deciduous forests around the Redding area, up above 2,000 feet. In this area dominated by black oak primarily, higher elevations by other things like aspen or poplar. Far more abundant in the eastern United States where it's the dominant type of community or biome there. So they can get fairly hot summers, get into the 80s, 90s, but also then still have relatively cold winters. So again, kind of refer to the temperature precipitation graph. Rich topsoil that has a lot of organic matter. So especially back east, a lot of these temperate deciduous forests were cleared. The wood was used to build homes, to build cities, but then the soil that was left behind, because it was good, was actually farmed. So we lost a lot of these forests back the previous couple hundred years as we settled. Cleared the wood for products, for heat, for fire in other words, but then also used the soil for farming. And again, a variety of animals, some which were sought after as enemies, like the wolves, mountain lions, grizzly bear, bison that were hunted to near extinction in a variety of deciduous forests and grasslands. But a lot of these animals have been reestablished in these areas, or they've made comebacks on their own as we started protecting this habitat more. So again, as I mentioned, kind of the take-home message of this forest is a lot of them were used, destroyed, if you will, by poor logging practices and just the process of urbanization, building cities. And we're talking about this with respect to North America, but also Europe. And really, this was one of the reasons why settlers came to this country, looking for new resources. People had lived in Europe for a long, long time prior to them seeking other places to live. So a lot of their original deciduous forests were already used up, and so they were looking for new examples of places to settle and resources to have access to. So temperate deciduous forest was a very important ecosystem for us developing this country and being as successful as we have been. Kind of go to the central part of the United States and we get into the temperate grasslands. We get a variety of different types of grasslands, tall grass prairies, short grass prairies. As simple as it sounds, some were dominated by taller grasses and got more rainfall. Others were dominated by literally shorter grasses that got less rainfall. Characterized by hot summers, cold winters, not unlike the temperate deciduous forest, but less rainfall than the forests, 10 to 30 inches on average. And it's this lesser amount of rainfall that basically keeps these areas as grasslands, not dominated by trees or shrubs. Bigger plants, as you might guess, need more water to survive. So grass plants don't need as much water as, say, a pine tree or an oak tree. So these areas were grasslands, and they always were grasslands because of the amount of precipitation. So because these areas tend to be pretty rich in organic matter, and because that means they also have relatively good soil, a lot of the grasslands in this country and other countries were converted to agriculture. Again, enough water to grow plants like grasses or crops like wheat or corn, but not enough for growing trees. So again, a lot of these grassland prairies were plowed for agriculture, and right now in North America, these native grasslands are the rarest biome left in this country. Again, most of it had been converted to agriculture. If you look at a map of California prior to, say, 1850, and you look at the distribution of all the grasslands, and then you compare that to today, there are very small little pockets of native grasslands that are left in California and throughout the Dakotas on south through Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. So again, another very endangered ecosystem that it's going to be hard to really bring any of this back into grassland. Where we're always working on that, but again, so much of it has already been converted to food production that it's going to be hard to get much more of it back. So in California, we have the grasslands typically down in the low elevations, and then also some of the higher deserty plateaus based on rainfall. In California, above the grasslands are communities like the chaparral. Again, you can look at the temperature and precipitation graph. Doesn't have a lot of variation in temperature and precipitation throughout the year. Basically the standard sort of climate here are mild, moist winters, but hot, dry summers, which again is exactly what we get in Redding, for example. Hot summers with no precipitation, and then a winter season with all of our precipitation falling in maybe 4, 5, 6 months. So you can think about this as being a Mediterranean climate. That's what we refer to it as, which is because it is a climate that we also find in places around the Mediterranean Ocean. Think about, as I just said, we get very hot, dry summers and very cool, wet winters. So think about it from a plant's perspective. That's a pretty dramatic change to go from times of the year, at least in a normal year, which we don't seem to be having this year or the last couple, that you get all the rainfall you can stand and maybe almost too much for 6 months, and then the other 6 months you got nothing to access. So these plants have to be very well adapted to be drought tolerant, because every year, even in a normal rainfall year, because of the cyclic nature of the rainfall, they go through wet and dry periods where they have to be very resistant to those dry periods in order to survive until the next rainy season. The other thing that you probably already know about this type of community is that wildfires are very common throughout the summer and into the fall. And that's because these plants are actually adapted to that type of disturbance. We get the dry lightning strikes like we get around here that start fires. And it would have been very normal for an explorer to be coming through the Sacramento Valley in the summer and it to be all covered with smoke from the fires that are burning around the area from lightning strikes. So as much as we don't like when there are fires in the summer and the smoke that's left behind, it really probably was much worse than this back before we settled here, because the fires would have always been burning, and of course we wouldn't have been here to put them out. So the plants that live in the chaparral, many of them are fire adapted. They need fire to kind of burn them back, decrease their competition with other plants, and in some cases even the fire is needed for the seeds to be able to be viable and sprout back. But with that said, generally speaking, it's relatively thin and not the most fertile of soils. But again, the plants that are adapted to living in this dramatically changing condition can do pretty well. Let me go back to chaparral real quick. If you think about the placement of chaparral around the Valley of California, and you think about Southern California and the Bay Area, those large cities are right in the middle of the chaparral biome. So again, susceptible to fire. We have wildfires every year in these areas. The reason that they're as bad as they are is because of the decades, the 100 years or so that we've been putting out every fire that starts. And so now that we've been doing that for decades, all of that undergrowth, all of the brush species are growing, getting bigger than they would have ever gotten in the past, because they would have been burnt by a fire maybe every 3 to 5 years on average. And so now that we've spent all this time putting out all the fires, the brush has grown without fires for maybe decades, so it's missed numerous cycles of fire. And then finally a fire starts, accidentally or intentionally, and the fire is so intense that it's nearly impossible to put it out. So this is one of those biomes that we've kind of messed up with our practice of putting out all of the fires that start. So it's going to be a long road to get this biome back into a healthy, balanced state. One of the ways that we can do that, get that ecosystem back to healthy and balanced, is not by fire, but by using animals to browse that vegetation to keep it under control. And we are using goats to help actually fight future wildfires. We have about 6,000 wildfires per year on average, some very large, some very small. And again, because most of the people in California are living in this biome, we've had to find ways to deal with this problem other than with fire. And so goats have been used for quite a while now to clear vegetation. They'll eat almost anything. And basically during the fire season, on average, you could use a couple hundred goats and they could easily clear an acre of heavy brush per day. So you basically can manage the goats, kind of fence them in, or use dogs to kind of keep them in an area, let them browse on the vegetation. The challenge is basically that they will eat everything. So in areas where you have endangered plants, or you might have endangered plants, there's got to be some work to check that out first, and then if necessary actually fence off some of those areas so the goats don't browse those plants as well. Again, they're not selective. They'll eat what we think is good vegetation, and they'll eat what we think is bad vegetation. So it's kind of an all or nothing thing here. So there are definitely positive benefits, but there also are some negative side effects as well of using animals to graze vegetation. The desert biome, again, characterized across the world by very limited precipitation, by daily temperature extremes. It can be very, very hot during the daytime, 120, 130 degrees in places like Death Valley. But then it can also be below freezing in the evenings at certain times of the year. So again, you have to have plants and animals that have evolved in this area to first of all be able to resist the dryness of the area. Deserts are defined as any area that has less than 10 inches of rain a year, and some have even way less than that. But then those animals also, and plants, also have to be able to deal with the very hot and very cold extremes. So we typically think of vegetation like cactus as being a typical desert plant, yucca plants, sagebrush even, a variety of other shrub species that can exist in these areas. Very little organic matter in the soil, but it does have high mineral contents. So again, those plants that have adapted and evolved to live in these areas can thrive off of this climate, but again, not overly productive soils. Most of the animals that live in these areas are relatively small animals, and they've developed the habit of being nocturnal. Nocturnal meaning that they only come out in the evening. So they avoid the high day temperatures by living underground where it's cooler, by being in the shade, just not being active. We know that if we go outside in the middle of a hot summer day and do much activity, you start sweating. That's water loss. In a desert, animals and plants have all the adaptations to avoid water loss. So while there are some animals that will be out during the daytime, many of them are only active at night, so they're not losing an excess amount of water from their body. So a variety of insects, spiders, amphibians that are adapted, a lot of reptiles, snakes, lizards. And again, there are some animals. You could have coyotes, some different species of birds that exist in these areas as well. Because of the amount of soil that's exposed, if you look at this image, you can see a lot of bare soil. These areas are obviously susceptible to erosion, not so much because of the rainfall or the slope of the land, but more by us going in there, using the land for off-highway vehicle work, mineral extraction. Anything that we do as humans to disturb the soil can cause erosion. And then you have the ability of that land loses its ability to grow as much vegetation, which then there isn't as much vegetation to support the animals. So much like when we talked about the tundra, because the deserts are very extreme, hot, cold, and dry, they are much more susceptible to the impacts of us, therefore damaging it to the point where they can no longer stay in balance. Then we have areas that are called savannas, kind of tropical grassland areas that may have scattered clumps of trees, typically things like something in the acacia family, mesquite, or various types of acacia like catclaw acacia. Low or very intense seasonal rainfalls, where they might get 30 to 60 inches of rainfall a year, but even more extreme than in areas like Redding, they have very long dry periods with only very short but maybe intense periods of rainfall. Again, low mineral content in the soil, but again, there's enough vegetation, grass-type vegetation, to support herds of large herbivores, plant eaters, like antelopes, giraffes, zebra, elephants, wildebeest. And then also because there's a relatively large amount of these herbivores, then that can certainly support carnivores like lions or cheetahs or hyenas. Again, like our grasslands in the United States, a lot of the savannas have been converted to cattle grazing, and so then that decreases the amount of habitat for the native species. So these areas are scattered throughout Africa, parts of Australia and South America, West India, but not really any true savannas in the United States. Then on to tropical rainforests. The most biodiverse, the lushest type of habitat we have on the planet, and it's able to be that way because the climate is warm and moist year-round. Lots of rainfall can support a lot of plants, and because the temperature is always pretty similar, whether you're January or May or June, it can support a high species richness. So lots of different species of plants, which means you can have a lot of different species of animals. Typically, the tropical rainforests are characterized by multiple layers of vegetation, typically 3 layers where you have a ground layer, a medium shrub or tree layer, and an upper canopy of trees. But you can also have several layers, more than that, within a tropical rainforest. So the warm temperatures and the high amount of moisture create the perfect conditions for living things to decompose quickly when they die. So that's where the source of nutrients are, right? When plants and animals die in an environment, as they decompose, that nutrient that was in their bodies then gets put back in the soil to feed another generation of plants. So again, you have a high rate of decomposition, which makes these areas seem very fertile. I say seem because everything is fine as long as the ecosystem is in place and it's functioning like it should. The challenge comes when we, as humans, go into these areas and cut the wood, or we clear an area to grow a crop like coffee or bananas. Once you upset the ecosystem by clearing areas, you remove the vegetation, what you're doing is you're removing the nutrients. And because otherwise these soils are relatively low in nutrients because they decompose so quickly, they don't stay in the soil very long. They break down, they're used by the plants, and then they're pretty much gone. So once you remove the plants, you're removing the source of nutrients. So these areas can be degraded pretty rapidly by removing the vegetation. And that's certainly one of the biggest challenges in the areas of the world where there are tropical rainforests. So we think of South America obviously as a primary tropical rainforest, but parts of South Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, parts of Australia, a lot of the islands in the Southeast Asian area are of this tropical rainforest community. All right, so that's a kind of a quick overview of all the terrestrial biomes. So again, remember for sakes of quizzes to be able to talk a little bit about each of those biomes, kind of understand what characterizes that biome. So a general idea, a lot of precipitation or little precipitation, hot temperatures, cold temperatures, the types of plants, the types of animals that live in those areas. And again, if any of those areas have challenges, like the tropical rainforest challenges us cutting all the plants down, or the grasslands being converted to agriculture, make sure you know kind of the challenges those biomes face as well. All right, so on to the aquatic ecosystems. There are basically freshwater ecosystems and saltwater ecosystems. We'll talk about the freshwater ecosystems here a little bit, and then also we'll talk about the saltwater ecosystems in chapter 11. We can break freshwater ecosystems down into two main types of standing water ecosystems like lakes and ponds, or flowing water ecosystems like rivers and streams. And then in some cases, like this book does, we also separate out wetlands, which can be further broken down into types that are marshes or types that are swamps. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit later. Have a variety of organisms that live in these ecosystems. Obviously, just like ecosystems on land, there are small things, and then there are larger things. There are plants that feed the animals. So in aquatic ecosystems, you have the same situation. But you also have microscopic things like we find above on the terrestrial ecosystems as well. So within the water, you're going to have plankton, phytoplankton, zooplankton. Phytoplankton are basically like microscopic plants. They use the sun's energy to make their energy. And the zooplankton are microscopic animals. So in an aquatic ecosystem, the plankton are the bottom of the food chain. They're the thing that feeds everything else above it. Then you have the nekton, so the larger vertebrates like fish and turtles, and the benthos, the bottom dwellers, the things that live down in the sand or muck, or things that are at the bottom of the water. Interesting thing about freshwater is we all know how important water is to our survival. And in years like we've had the last couple here, we start really worrying about water. The Shasta Dam is, the Shasta Lake, I should say, is very low right now. And unless we get a lot of water, it may not even fill up this year. So fresh water is a very precious commodity on planet Earth. It only occupies about 2% of the surface of the Earth. So if you look at the entire surface of the Earth, only about 2% of it is fresh water. Yet again, it's very important for a lot of things, everything on this planet. Again, we have standing water ecosystems, which would be things like lakes and ponds. And you can look at various zones within those standing water ecosystems. Just as we talked about the tropical rainforests having multiple layers to them, water ecosystems also can have multiple layers. The littoral zone, right near the edge of the water, the limnetic zone, which is kind of the bulk of the open area, the open water of a lake, and the profundal zone, which is down near the very bottom. So basically this zonation or layering of a standing water ecosystem allows it to typically create thermal strata. So colder near the bottom, warmer as you get near the top. So it creates these different zones that basically allows for things like turnover, which basically is a mixing of the water. Because there are different layers, cold water is more dense than warm water, so it settles near the bottom. But then as you go into a springtime, when it gets warmer and the surface water gets warmer, it basically changes the balance of the standing water ecosystem, and then basically those layers will mix and become one, and then they'll start stratifying again later in the season as the water cools down. Some of the main effects that we have caused to standing water ecosystems are things like eutrophication, which is really a big word for saying that we basically are fertilizing the water. So natural standing water ecosystems are going to be fertilized by natural processes. And again, all I mean here are that the plants or animals that live in or near the waterway, when they die, they get decomposed, and those nutrients can be recycled. The problem becomes when we as humans are adding additional nutrients to that water system. So where do you think most of those would come from? Unnatural nutrients. So something like agriculture probably pops to mind. If there are fields, agricultural fields nearby, the fertilizer we use to grow food, some of that is going to run off and get into the water system. Products that we use around our home, like soaps, soap that we use to wash our clothes, used to contain phosphates. So phosphates are another type of fertilizer. When we do our laundry and the water used to just kind of go out the house and across the ground and into the soil. Anything that lands on the ground, gets into the soil, will eventually migrate its way to the nearest waterway. Water gathers there because it's lower than the surrounding area. So those are the kinds of things we've done to artificially enrich these areas. Now again, you might think that that's not a bad thing. Add a little fertilizer, the ecosystem can be more productive. But again, the problem is not that it's more productive, it's that it typically gets thrown out of its natural balance. So some things thrive on that extra nutrient, other things don't. And so again, it's more about making an imbalanced environment. So then we have flowing water ecosystems, streams, rivers, so forth. Again, water in this case flows, it's moving, it's not standing like it would in a pond or a lake. And basically, it can change rapidly if the source is up at the top of a mountain from snow melt. Then you move down the mountain, the river tends to get wider, it tends to meander back and forth more, which creates floodplains where the excess water flows to when there's more water than the system can handle. And then typically these areas form a mouth when they flow into into a lake or out into the ocean. So you have a variety of different living things that can exist in all these different layers or zones, from the high elevation down to where that flows into a lake or an ocean. The biggest impact that we've done to flowing water ecosystems are dams. Pollution as well. You think about it, most big cities originally grew near water, whether it was an ocean or a big river. That way you could ship things, you could have easier access to these towns, and goods that were made could be shipped to other places. So that means that industry develops, and industry, of course, we know creates pollution. And where does that pollution go? Typically into the nearby water. Certainly it did before we knew any better, but even today, pollution we generate still ends up in the water. But then specifically with respect to rivers, the other major impact that we've had on those areas are from damming them up. In the United States, most of the large river systems are dammed at this point, and a lot of the smaller ones are as well. We dam them to store water like we do for Shasta Dam, so that water can be used throughout the year to irrigate our crops, to provide water for wildlife, provide opportunities for recreation that wouldn't have been there if it was a river instead of a lake. And then certainly all the other things we need water for, like drinking for our survival. We said the third category was wetlands, and we have two kinds of wetlands. Marshes are dominated by grassy type plants, whereas swamps are dominated by woody plants, woody trees and shrubs, like the cypress swamp that we see on this image on the slide. These are very productive communities because, again, they have unlimited amount of water. All the living things in this area, when they die, they accumulate in the bottom of the water, so there's a lot of nutrients there. And they can become anaerobic, which means without oxygen. So that can actually slow the rate of decomposition down. So it's like having a very slow release fertilizer. When you compare that to what we talked about with the tropical rainforests, where the nutrients cycle very, very rapidly. Of course, if you're a plant living in water most of the year, if not all of the year, you need to be able to be adapted to being waterlogged. So plants need oxygen just like animals do. And if your roots are underwater all the time, how do you get oxygen? Don't know if any of you have ever seen like a cypress swamp, kind of like the image we see here, but there will be parts of the root system that actually poke out of the water. And we call those knees, like our knee. And basically that's a specialized root that lives above the water line so that it can exchange oxygen from the environment to keep the plant alive. Again, these are very important ecosystems because they provide a lot of services, not only wildlife habitat for those animals that need that kind of habitat, but also very important in mitigating floods. These floodplain areas historically would be the place where the excess water would be stored when it was flowing downriver. And so that mitigates the damage that could be done by a very large flood. But also, we consider wetlands kind of the kidneys of the environment. In our body, our kidneys filter out toxins and then allow them to leave the body through our urine. So the wetlands are kind of the same. Again, water, wherever it hits the ground, anywhere on this planet, is going to end up in the nearby water source, whether it's a lake, stream, river, or a wetland. And so water that flows into a wetland slows down. It has a long time to kind of percolate into that waterlogged soil, and all the plants and animals and bacteria that live in this ecosystem filter out any of those toxins that have been accumulated in that waterway. We'll talk about this later, but we're actually building artificial wetlands around cities to serve as natural ways to clean up our sewage, for example. All the real bad stuff is taken out of it in a sewage treatment plant, and then the effluent water is filtered into a wetland where it slowly continues to be purified to the point where then it just flows into the nearest lake, stream, or river. So we've polluted these areas, we've developed them, we've drained them to grow plants for our own benefit. We've harvested the trees for their products. And so it's our goal now to continue to try and restore and add wetlands back into the environment. We also have another aquatic ecosystem that we call a brackish area or an estuary. The difference here is that these are wetland areas that are basically saltwater instead of freshwater, like we were just talking about. So these are areas that are dramatically affected by tides as they rise and fall from the ocean, and basically have a lot of variability with respect to how salty they are. In low tide times, they're going to be less salty because the fresh water that pushes out to the ocean from the river has a bigger influence when the tide is low. But then when the tides are high, the salt water is pushing farther upriver, and so the fresh water is being pushed farther back upriver. So again, you have a very productive ecosystem that is very rapid at cycling nutrients through it. A lot of diversity, very productive, but also very susceptible to development. Again, we like living near the ocean. We like living in these areas, or we like vacationing in these areas. But we also are developing aquaculture around the world, growing seafood sort of in the ocean, but somewhat still caged in. And so those areas that are being developed or being changed obviously are far more likely to be impacted negatively. Salt marshes are shallow wetlands that have grasses, kind of like we talked about with marshes in freshwater. And then we have areas in tropical zones that are equivalent to the salt marshes but are dominated by mangroves, the image on the lower right of the screen. Again, very, very productive, specialized plants and animals that can deal with that fluctuating salt level. But again, very important ecosystem to humans because of all the food and then the recreational opportunities and etc. So I'm not exactly sure why your book decided to lump evolution in with the biomes. They probably should be two separate chapters, but we'll go with it. So now for something completely different. You could say that it's related in general because the biomes that we just talked about are where they are because they've adapted to those conditions. They've adapted to the precipitation and temperature ranges that exist in that part of the world. How do plants and animals adapt to a climate? Well, it's through a very long process that we call evolution. The book is defining evolution as cumulative genetic changes in populations of living things that occur over successive generations. So given lots of time and a lot of generations of plants or animals, genetic changes that are beneficial to those living things tend to be transferred to future generations, because if it helps them survive, the offspring that have that genetic difference should in general be more likely to survive, and if they're more likely to survive, then those genes are going to be passed on to the next generation and the next generation and so forth. Now, kind of when I talk about this section, I always feel obligated to throw in a couple of comments. It's unfortunate that we get people who are Christian or people who are scientists that don't even try to understand the other group. So, for example, if you have scientists who by nature we want to see the evidence, if I can't see it or test it, then it must not be true. You also then have the far other side of the spectrum for people that are Christians or other religions, I guess, who faith is what they believe in, that they just have faith in the Word of God. So again, what I'm not trying to do in this chapter is convince Christians that they're wrong or scientists that they're wrong. What I'm trying to do is, as the book does, is just present the evidence that we've collected over a long period of time with respect to how living things on this planet have adapted to their conditions. I'm a Christian. I don't go to church at this point any longer. I have read the Bible cover to cover more than one time. But I've also been trained as a scientist for the past 30 years, going back to when I first started college. All I can say is I believe that those two things, God and science, or specifically evolution, don't have to be exclusive, that there can be both of those things in a belief. There's always that challenge that people have of saying, well, if God isn't real, then how did life first start on the planet? You can't get something from nothing. If there was no life, how did the first life come about? And there have been a lot of things you've probably seen on TV where scientists have been able to put a bunch of inorganic stuff together and introduce lightning, that kind of thing. And then these inorganic, non-living things mutate and become organic things. Again, it's not like you put a bunch of goo in a big bottle and you introduce lightning and you get a frog crawling out of there. Again, we're talking about single-celled organisms that are the very basic life form. I've thought about this a lot, trying to figure out, for me personally, how these two things can make sense. So this is just kind of what I've decided that I tend to feel is as good of an explanation as anything. Why couldn't it be that God or some sort of entity created that first little single-celled life form and then gave the earth a bunch of laws to follow. We know by studying the earth and by studying the universe, there are laws, things that are constant, things that are always the same. They don't change. They follow rules. So again, in my mind, I'm not saying you have to believe this either, but in my mind, I don't see why you couldn't justify or understand this by saying that some entity, God, whatever you want to call it, created the first life form. It wasn't, in my mind, again, my perspective, it wasn't a full-blown human, or it wasn't a final-looking bird or a snake out of the blue. It was this single-celled basic life form that we still have on the planet today. But again, a set of natural laws were also created. And given time, we were allowed to evolve into all of the different living things that are on the planet today. Again, I know that the Bible specifically kind of outlines how long that we've been on this planet, and that's much, much, much less than what evolution would say. We're talking billions of years from the first life form to where we are now. The Bible's talking thousands of years. Again, if you take the Bible literally as 4,000 years being 4,000 years, or do you take the Bible sort of and interpret, what is a day or a year or an hour to a being like God? Time, we don't know, we don't really understand time. I mean, can any of you picture what a billion books would look like if they were all piled outside your house? Would it be your whole block? Would it be the whole city? Would it, numbers like that are really hard for us to understand. So if a billion books is hard to really imagine, how do we imagine what a billion or a million years was like? I think the biggest challenge we have with evolution is not really understanding the process is a very, very, very slow process that takes thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years for things to happen. So, with that as kind of my introduction, let's move on with this topic. Charles Darwin is generally the person credited with developing the mechanisms of evolution, not the idea of evolution, but the mechanisms, how evolution actually happens, and he wrote this in his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. There was another gentleman who came up with the same mechanism around the same time, but we don't know who he is. Most of us don't know of his name. But so Charles Darwin was the guy credited with this theory. And for him, it was kind of the right thing at the right time, being in the right place at the right time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, on future slides. But basically, in very basic language, he indicated that the environment plays a very important role in which specific traits a living thing inherits. So again, a biome, a desert biome. What kind of plants are in a desert biome? Things like cacti. Do cacti have big, thin leaves that could desiccate with the hot, dry weather? No, they're very compact. They don't tend to have a lot of leaves, or if plants in deserts do, they're very thick leaves, very succulent leaves. They're adapted to living in a very hot, dry climate. Did that happen overnight? No. Did climates change to what they are now overnight? No. Things change in thousands or tens of thousands of years, not quickly. So as a climate starts becoming drier and hotter, slowly over time, whatever plants are living there, as that climate is getting hotter and drier than it was before, there are some plants that have some genetic variability in them, and sometimes the offspring will have a slightly different characteristic than their parent plants. If that characteristic helps them survive, they obviously survive. And if they reproduce, then those genes, those traits, are pushed on to the next generation. However, most of those little differences, which are basically caused by random mutations of cells, most of those are bad. Mutations generally are not good. On occasion, very rare occasion, there may be the little bit of a difference that helps that animal survive a little bit better than the next one. But most of the time, those mutations result in traits that are not beneficial, and that plant or animal doesn't survive on into the long term. But by accumulating favorable traits over a very long period of time, that's going to make you a little better able to survive than maybe another plant or animal. So again, if it's thorns for a plant that keep it from being eaten by an animal, or if you're a predator and you got a little better eyesight, or your legs are a little longer that gives you a little more speed, or if you're a prey species that happens to look a little more like the vegetation you live in so that a predator couldn't see you as easily, if those little subtle differences accumulate over a long enough period of time, those favorable traits can lead to better survival. So any adaptation that a plant or animal has, and any evolutionary changes that that plant or animal gets over time that improve their ability to survive, means they're going to reproduce more, they're more likely going to reproduce, and that means they're going to be successful, or they're going to be more fit for the environment they live in. So there are basically 4 general observations that guide our theory of natural selection. We know all living things on this planet can make more offspring than can ever survive. Most plants, animals, and humans for that matter, not today since we have medicine, but thinking way back in time, can produce more offspring than are ever going to be able to survive. So the idea is, if you put a lot of possibilities out there, as long as a few of them survive, and those few that survive are going to be the most fit for the environment, then they'll carry on the next generation. So in other words, we're trying to make more offspring than we know will survive, just so there's a whole bunch of possibilities for survival. But then you compare that with the fact that as big as the Earth is, as big as some of the biomes are, they are only a finite size. And so if there's not unlimited space, there can't be unlimited growth. So the Earth has a lot of built-in mechanisms that limit population growth. Space, food, anything that's limited is basically going to limit the ability of a population to grow. We also know now, Darwin didn't then, but we know now that genetically we can inherit characteristics from our parents. Whether it's a fish, a tree, a human, characteristics are genetically programmed into us that we inherit from our parents. But we also know that there is differential reproductive success. Again, not all individuals can produce the same amount of offspring. Individuals that are not as fit, maybe they're not quite as able to survive a drought, they're stressed all the time. You got a plant that's just, in good years it does fine, but in dry years it just doesn't do so well. If it's not doing so well in those dry years, what's that mean? It's not going to put as much energy into making offspring. So those 4 basic observations guide our idea of natural selection. And since Darwin, as I just mentioned, we've been able to understand this inheritance of variability as being genetic and DNA related. And we also know now, by all of the work we've been able to do, looking at genetics, that mutations provide variation in living things. Now again, I think most of us associate the word mutation with bad, right? Cancer cells are normal cells that something causes them to mutate, and that uncontrolled mutated growth is what causes a type of cancer. And that's true. Most mutations are not good. But over a long period of time and a lot of individual members of a population, every once in a while there's a mutation that maybe is a benefit to that living thing. And if that living thing survives and is better fit for the environment, That means it can reproduce, and if it reproduces, it's more likely that characteristic will be transferred to the next generation. So how did Darwin come up with this theory? Was it just, looking at stuff and thinking about it and saying this is good? Well, again, I mentioned earlier he was kind of in the right place at the right time. Back in his day, whenever there were people out exploring with ships, they would typically have a naturalist on board the ship. The naturalist was somebody who typically might have been a medical doctor, as well as somebody who knew about plants and animals, somebody who knew about rocks. Why would this stuff be important? Well, if you're a ship and you're out on a multiple year voyage, you need somebody who can help you figure out where to look for water to drink. You're never going to be able to store enough water on a ship to last you for 5 years. That also means you're not going to be able to store enough food to last you for 5 years. So the naturalist was practical in that they would typically try and find food and so forth for the crew to survive on. But then that also gave them the opportunity to just document what they saw. Again, Darwin was fortunate that on the Beagle, the ship he was on, they happened to sail off the coast of Ecuador in South America and stumbled on the Galapagos Islands. On their visit to all these different islands of the Galapagos, he studied all the different plants and animals on each of the islands. And among other things, he studied a series of finches, 14 different species of finches that existed on different islands. He found one species of finch that was in an area on one particular island that fed a certain way. Some finches had really stout beaks for breaking seeds. Others had longer, thinner beaks that they could use for getting bugs out of trees. Some fed on plants or were nectarivores. They ate nectar. Some lived on the ground. Others lived up in trees. And he found all of these different finches had a common ancestor. So in other words, when these islands kind of broke away from the continent, they were probably one large island that had a finch on it. Over, again, a long period of time, as these individual islands kind of broke off and moved away from each other, that finch population got stranded on all these islands. At that time, it would have been the same finch. But as those islands got farther apart and more isolated, those finches, because they were exposed to different climates based on whether some were farther north or south, different vegetation that evolved on those islands, required those finches either adapt to those conditions or go extinct. And he actually identified, which is number 1 on this image, that there was an ancestral finch back in Ecuador that basically was the original finch species that now had evolved into these 14 different finches. And so the only way that could have happened is if they were originally from that one finch. And as those islands moved and spread out, those finches had to adapt because they were isolated, and they had to adapt because there were different plants evolving on those islands. He also was able to make similar observations with some of the other species on the island, but it was the finches, what are called Darwin's finches, that were sort of one of the big pieces of evidence for this theory of evolution. Some other things that we've looked at since then as evidence for evolution are, for example, looking back at fossil records and being able to trace fossil records of animals over long periods of time. We could tell they were related because of how similar they were, but we could also see how they evolved different ways of living in the environment. We go back to what was the ancestor of the horse. It was much smaller, didn't really look like a horse, but we were able to follow step by step that species over time as it showed these various little changes that happened over millions of years to be now what we have that we have on the planet now that we call a horse. We also can just look at comparative anatomy. We pick 4 different mammals. Mammals are all related to each other because they have hair on their body. For example, they give live birth, they don't lay eggs, that kind of thing. So humans are mammals, a horse is a mammal, a cat is a mammal, and a bat is a mammal. And so even though we're very different from each other, we still have a common lineage that we're all mammals. So that means that if we look at the anatomy of these things, we should be able to find similarities. For example, the arm bone of a human is composed of the humerus, the radius and ulna, and then the various carpals and metacarpals and phalanges that make up our wrist and our fingers. In a horse, we can find the humerus, the radius and ulna are sort of fused together. We can see the carpals, and then the equivalent to the metacarpals and phalanges. Again, horses have hooves, not fingers, so they still modified and evolved to best fit their environment. But still, we can identify that same pattern of bones whether we're looking at a cat or a bat. Since bats can fly, their phalanges are very much extended, and the skin is webbed between the digits. But those same bones are still there. So even though we didn't evolve directly from a cat, or a cat didn't evolve directly from a bat, way, way, way back in time, there were a lot of other mammals that evolved kind of off of each other, as kind of shown by the graph on the bottom. Genetically now, again, we can look molecular levels and see that things like humans, ducks, rattlesnakes, tuna, moths, microscopic organisms all share a lot of commonality with respect to nucleotides that we share. Again, some are more similar. We have more in common with a pig than we do a duck or a rattlesnake. Again, the other challenge that people have is that they look at this graph and think that a pig evolved from us, or we evolved from a pig, and that's absolutely not the case. We always think of looking at like a tree, right? The tree has one stem, so there was a common thing a very long time ago. And as you move up the tree and you start having branches going in different directions, you might have a common ancestor that was 200, 500 million years ago, and that common ancestor might still be on the planet, or it might be extinct. But there's been a lot of branches since then. So there really is no, I'm not saying, and I don't think most people who argue for evolution say that we evolved directly from a yeast. All we're saying is that we had some commonalities millions and millions and millions of years ago. And because of all the different environmental things that each living thing had to adapt to, we all evolved differences to adapt to those conditions. So again, just presenting some of the scientific basis. You could take an entire course in evolution or natural selection. So we're certainly not doing it justice by having one little section of an environmental science textbook. But again, just wanted to make sure that I presented some of the evidence to you, and with that you can decide what you believe. But again, all I want to get across is I don't think that evolution and believing in God have to be exclusive of each other. I'm a scientist. I believe in God. There's a lot of other scientists out there that believe in God, and I kind of coined this phrase, and maybe I heard it before, maybe I made it up and somebody else came up with it at the same time, but I kind of like to call it creative evolution. Got creation that's acknowledging there's a greater force out there that is responsible for life on this planet, but that life still was given the freedom to change and adapt over time. All right, the last section of this chapter deals with another process of change over time, and that relates specifically to the plant community and a term called ecological succession, which is the process of a plant community that develops and changes over time where you have the orderly replacement of some plants by other plants that are more adapted to the conditions that they're living in at that moment. And it's a fundamental concept of understanding the environment. If we're going to make decisions on how to manage an environment or how to fix it, get it back to the way it used to be, we have to understand how the community got to the way it is, how it got there naturally, and how we affected it to make it the way it is now. So an important part of this is understanding that whatever living things are in a community at a given time, in other words, the resident species, just them being there, living there, is modifying the environment. And that change over time typically is making the land, the habitat, the community more suitable for a different type of species, and therefore less suitable for what's there now. And so it's that changing of the environment that slowly causes succession to occur over time. Not that long ago, we used to think there was such a thing as a climax community, which is a stable point of development. So when you reach this point, whatever types of plants or animals you have there, it's stable. It won't change. But if something major like a wildfire kills everything there, we used to think that meant that that plant community, after the fire, would always grow back to what it was, given time. It would always go back to that climax, stable community. In reality, now we know that plant communities, and therefore animals, are continually changing. You might think of a climax community as a line, a slope, maybe a line that goes from low to high. It starts off low, and over time it gets higher and higher until it reaches sort of a plateau, a flat area. If a fire pushes it off the edge, it goes back down to the bottom of the hill, but then it slowly works its way back up the hill. It changes, it evolves, and then it's stable again. Again, today we like to think of it more as something like a roller coaster. It goes up, it goes down, it changes from one community to another. Whatever the climate might be, you have a changing climate, so you're going to have a changing community. It might reach a stable point for a period of time, but then again, the climate can change and push it to a different point. So again, if you can kind of visualize a line that starts at the floor and goes up to the ceiling, and then there's a flat spot up there, that would be the old way of thinking of stable climax community. And if you think of it now as being a roller coaster where you have a bunch of ups and downs, the downs could be stable for a little while, but if the climate changes, it could push it up the slope and over the next hump and back down to a different low spot. So multiple stable communities over time, not just one. We also have what we call primary or secondary succession. Primary succession is when we start from bare ground. The best example is either, I talked about glaciers earlier. As the glacier is growing, it's pushing along the ground and it's scraping all the soil down to bare rock. Maybe even an easier way to think of primary succession is you have an under-ocean volcano that erupts, and slowly the lava builds up, and eventually what happens? It pokes out of the water. That's how the Hawaiian Islands were formed. Given a long time, you go from bare rock, but given a long time, you start building up stuff. Pioneer species like lichen might get there, blown by the wind. They live on the rocks. Eventually, they might slowly be replaced by moss. The more that these plants live and die, the organic matter from those dead plants starts building up. You eventually get shrubs and eventually might get other plants like trees. But this is a very, very slow process because, again, you don't have soil. You just got bare rock. Bare rock is the building block of soil, because soil is eroded, worn down rock, and then you add organic matter and other stuff. So primary succession is starting with bare rock in a very, very slow process that ultimately would result in one of those types of biomes that we talked about earlier. Secondary succession is what we as wildlife biologists or foresters can manage. Basically, we already have a community of plants and animals, which means there's soil, but then something can disturb that. Again, it could be a fire, it could be us clearing land to grow food, we could have a farm that's abandoned, and so you basically have plants kind of growing from what was there in the past. So you can have a change in the composition of species after some type of disturbance. Again, whether it's a fire, clear cutting a forest, leaving farmland alone. But the key thing here, it's much quicker. It can take 100 years, it can take more, it can take much less, but soil is already there. So what does the soil provide? As opposed to bare rock, the soil still provides a place for plants to grow. A plant seed can't land on a rock and just sink its roots into the rock and grow. If there's a crack in the rock, yeah, the root could get down in there. But with soil already there, not only do the plants have a place to grow if their seeds happen to blow there, but typically plants, again, make many more seeds than can ever survive. So some of those seeds can live in the soil, and they can be there 10, 20, 30 years. And then when the right conditions occur, they can sprout. So secondary succession is much quicker. It typically means you've already got plants and things living in an area, and then that area is disturbed by something like a fire, and then the plant community grows back, but it can grow back much quicker. Again, because you've already got soil there. You've already got nutrients in the soil. You already have moisture storing. You already have seeds or roots of plants in that soil. So this chapter ends talking about wildfires. Again, this is another thing that I could spend the entire semester talking about. Any unexpected fire that burns in a biome is considered a wildfire. It was unexpected, it was started by lightning or some other natural event. Most ecosystems on this planet have evolved with fire. Tropical rainforests, not really. Temperate rainforests, not as much. But most other biomes have evolved with fire. And basically the benefit of fire is that it releases nutrients from either living or dead matter, living or dead plants or animals, which then basically creates fertilizer that stimulates new growth. It increases the soil erosion potentially, so that's a negative side effect, but again, natural. But it is a natural part of the environment, and some ecosystems are adapted to fire, others are even dependent on fire. They can't persist in an area unless there's a fire coming through on occasion to help regeneration or to minimize competition or a variety of other things. Again, when we started preventing fires going back about 100 years with Smokey the Bear, we basically set in motion a long process that dramatically has negatively impacted a lot of ecosystems on this planet, particularly in the United States, since that's what we're focusing on now. Because fire is a natural part of the environment, because a lot of plants are adapted to fire and they rely on fire for there to be succession, we, having put them out for so long, have interrupted the natural cycle of fire. And largely what that's resulted in is the buildup of a lot of vegetation that wouldn't have ever been so abundant. Again, when the fire goes through, it consumes excess vegetation, and the nutrients get put right back into the soil for use. If we keep putting fires out, and communities miss multiple cycles of fire, we've got some of those chaparral communities in Southern California that haven't had a fire in 50 or 60 years. And remember, I said earlier, when we were talking about chaparral, most chaparral communities burned on average every 5 or so years, maybe every 3 to 5 to 10 years. So if you have 50, 60 years worth of fuel buildup, when a fire does start, it tends to be much hotter than it would have ever been, which means it's much more destructive. So not only can it cause much greater erosion than a natural fire would, it can do much greater damage by killing things that would have normally not been killed by the type of fires that were natural. If you have a clay soil, think about this. What happens when you make a clay pot and you put it in the oven? It bakes hard, right? You can bake a clay pot and put water in it, and the water doesn't seep out of the clay. You can literally have fires that are so hot they bake the soil, which keeps water from getting down into the soil. It just runs across the top. So it causes erosion. If the soil doesn't get into the ground, it's not going to help the plants that live there. So again, a huge challenge that we face in the United States, particularly the western U.S., with respect to how we've messed up the fire cycling in the communities that are dependent on fire.